guys, and welcome to Mastering Hard Surface, Lesson 9. In this lesson, I'm going to continue on from Lesson 8, working on this same object. And like I was saying in the end of that lesson, what we're going to be doing in this one is polishing and refining this mesh up until the point where we need to collapse it to the first subdiv iteration, and then go in the last lesson on this piece and go in and add all those small scale details. So I'm going to try and show you what's possible at this resolution on the mesh throughout this lesson, and kind of show you at what point you start to have to realize that you're going to need to go up in resolution if you want to add in any more small scale detail. Now, the primary focus of this lesson is going to be to try and show you what's possible at this resolution, so you're not going in and collapsing the mesh early and adding in too much detail that's either going to change later on and all your hard work's going to be undone. Also, that if you're making major proportion changes to your mesh, that you're not squashing or distorting that detail that you've done. Even though it's been a little bit of time since I've worked as a modeler in the industry, I think what's always going to be a major issue for people is understanding how to get the base proportions of a mesh right before adding in those tiny details. And it's kind of hard to blame people for doing it that way, just kind of rushing through the first part of the mesh and then going in and adding in all sorts of crazy small detail that doesn't actually change the overall appearance of the mesh or the design of the mesh, but it does kind of fake that. It's hard to explain. It kind of fakes how you interpret the mesh, or how they're trying to show off their skill. Now, guys like Vitaly Bulgarov have mastered that art to a point where they know exactly how to add in those small scale details early on, because in their head they can already see the overall design. But that takes years, that takes 10 years of modeling experience before you get to that point. So when you see people posting meshes that have so many small details but the overall design's crappy, it doesn't give the appearance that they know what they're doing. So even though there's a lot of problems with this mesh, and I'm going to be going in throughout this lesson and fixing those up, the main point is that in that first lesson 8, I spent enough time refining the proportions of the mesh so that from different angles things seem to be smooth enough and believable enough where we've got enough of a baseline here to build on top of, knowing that when I add some smaller details and paneling and go in and make some corners sharper than others to give that metallic appearance, I'm not doing that in a way that ruins the overall design of the mesh, because we've already blocked that out. So to get started, I don't usually work in any particular order at this point. I just go through and kind of one by one work on areas until everything's clean and tidy. But there are problems here, like you can see here. It just doesn't look very good. It's not integrating well. There's no other area on the mesh where this shape appears. So I'll need to experiment and see how I can fix that. And because the geometry is so low res, that's going to be quite easy to do without risking losing any of this stuff, because it only took a couple of minutes to cut this in the first place. So it's not like hell's going to freeze over while trying to fix everything. So in order to fix this area, the first thing I'm going to do is select the border here and just go in and delete these faces. I'll just shrink this. And I'm just going to experiment with cutting out this piece of the mesh and trying to get it to hit a corner. You can see it's hitting a corner here. I'm going to try and make that happen down here. So what I'm going to do is because at the moment all these elements are part of the same mesh, to get a little bit more free access to this, you can go in and use the hide unselected, the show only selected options and hiding polygons, but I tend to work a little bit more simple than that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to detach the object up the top there using the detach button, and that's just going to make that element I've selected a separate object. Now I did just put a FFD on there, just experimenting before the lesson started, so don't worry about that. But now I've got this mesh here but I don't have all the modifier stack on there to simulate what's happening on these other pieces. So the easiest way to do that is just to select over both of those, and if you hit the turbo smooth at the top, you can control select, or if you have a much larger stack, you can hit the top of it and then hit shift, and that will select everything within that, just like you would in, with any other type of selection. So I'm going to select over these two and copy them, and then I can paste those modifiers onto the new object. So you very quickly got that set up again. Just going to swap to screen mode and pull these vertices down here. And I'm just going to target weld that vertice up there and this vertice up here. And now I'm going to target this vertice and delete this one here. And what I'm doing is I'm reconnecting this edge loop so it's flowing evenly. Now when I select these two loops, these two vertices, and connect those, if I delete this one here, you can see I've changed the flow of the geometry. We've still got a nice curve happening here, but we don't have this weird shape in here that was kind of looking a little bit dodgy. So what's happened now is on the screen here you can see these 3 points, or these 4 points, are all lining up now. And as we get closer to this point here, it's starting to round out more and more. So you can see here it's quite hard, and then here it gets a little bit less hard, and then here it's perfectly smooth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this group of vertices here and just slide them up, because I'm trying to reduce the amount of curve that's happening here. And I might do the same for all these vertices as well, just to soften those curves off a little bit. I can probably just undo that just a little bit more. And keeping in the spirit of everything else I've been teaching, it's always good to have those edge loops flowing evenly. So you can see right now that kind of comes up and then back in. I want to make sure that they're all angled at the same degree, and it just makes things much easier to predict how they're going to smooth when you do that. So do the same for this one here. Now I can select this group of vertices, and I've just turned off edge constraint now. I'm just going to pull this in and just select this border and cap that off. So I'm going to delete this edge loop, which isn't flowing between anything at the moment. And I'm also going to delete this one because I'll probably need to go in and make that hard again, but in a more clean way. So I'm just trying to push all that geometry back in here and get it flowing again, while at the same time looking here at this kind of preliminary stage to make sure that the curve is going to work. And I'm still not sure it will, but what we've got going on here is, if you see how this vent kind of intake comes in, right now what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and keep that same curve flowing. So to explain that just a little bit, because this is quite important at this point in terms of how things are designed, I'm just going to take a screenshot of that and bring it into Photoshop just to show you what I mean. So when I have a curve up here like this, what I'm going to try and do here is simulate that same curve flowing. So if I shrink this down, we want it to look at least kind of similar, so that when this curve flows in here, it looks like they could all line up, like so. So I'm going to select these inside vertices, and you can see what I need to do to make that happen is I need to kind of pull these up here a little bit more, because right now that curve is too strong inwards. It's making too much of a kind of rounded circular shape, and I just need to flatten that off a little bit. I'm just going to keep experimenting with pulling this in more. And even though I'm messing up the geometry and everything at this point, it doesn't really matter because I'm going to go in and re-clean up all this surface anyway. So I'm going to select this edge loop and just totally get rid of it because I'm making such massive changes now that it's just going to cause too much pinching. It's much better to go in later and reconnect an edge along there to harden that off. So you can see here, if I target weld these points, I'm just trying to reduce the amount of geometry that's visible on this surface. And at this point also, what's probably best to do is to keep the edge loop flowing evenly so that the polygons are more square in shape, just as much as possible at least. And if I target weld these two together and then this one, you can see I've changed the flow of that geometry, so now everything's a little bit more evenly spaced, which is going to give us an opportunity later to, if we want to add an edge loop along here, now that will flow together. The reason that's not connecting through is because we've got those open-ended vertices here. But you can see that has left us with a triangular face here, which is quite easy to fix. All I have to do that is just to connect down here like so and delete this leftover edge there. Now what's happened is because I've added in that edge, we don't have all the geometry flowing evenly here. However, that might not matter so much because, as you can see, that curve is getting less and less rounded, which means that the geometry doesn't need to line up perfectly with the same amount of edge loops, because we'll probably get away with that more. Whereas if you had a massive big curve here, you would want the exact same amount of edge loops so that the spacing between them is perfectly even. And while talking about the spacing between these edge loops, there's one major change I want to make right now, and that's to reduce the amount of these kind of sliver like shapes going on here. The rest of the mesh is a lot more smooth and you've got areas of visual rest, but one of the major problems when cutting in details early on is that you don't have a good idea of how that's going to look in terms of the overall picture. And what I'm seeing here is if we zoom in, there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 individual pieces. In an ideal situation, I'd like to have only 3, but I think that's going to be not enough in this particular instance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here, and this is the benefit of having such low res geometry. I'm just going to go in and connect these two pieces and then remove the little details on the edge here. So if I select the two borders here, and I might need to just go in, you can see there's a couple of edge loops that got selected that I didn't want. I'm just going to unselect those. That's just because down the bottom here that was looping around. I'm just going to double check that we've got the same amount of edge loops, and we don't here. You can see we've got one that's missing. So I'm just going to quickly swap to vertice mode and cut one of those in, and then you just need to make sure you unselect that. Now I can bridge these two pieces, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all these edge loops. And actually before I do that, I'll just get rid of this loop going on down the bottom here. That loop that was right there, just so now when I do select those edge loops, I can get rid of all of them and kind of make a new piece here. Now one of the things that's happened is now that I've removed that inner kind of slivery detail, the spacing between these two has kind of gone out of whack. So what I need to do to fix that is first I'm just going to select one more loop here just to make it a bit easier on myself, and I'm going to remove that. Then I'm going to go in and select all these edge loops here and just start to pull those across. And I'm not doing it all at once, because you'll notice if I do that all at once, I'm going to have to make modifications down here anyway, as you can see, because when I drag that to the side, the spacing between these loops has gone out of sync. So that's why I'll undo that, and I'll only move the bits that are going to go to the right, just roughly until they're even. I will have to make some little modifications to this later, I assume. And then up the top here, I'm just going to move all these in as well, until it's sitting in the center there. And hopefully this gives us a little bit more a couple more areas of visual rest on the object, so that when we do add in those small scale panels and things like that, it'll look a little bit nicer. And you can see up the top here, we're getting quite bad spacing. So to fix that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to merge this into one single point. So to do that, I'm just going to go here, target weld this top point, and actually I'll just go in and select all these bits of geometry and delete them. And then this piece here on the very edge, I can actually just select the edge. I'm going to pull that in. Now I'm just going to connect these two pieces. And I've got edge constraint turned on when I'm moving these. You can see I'm trying to get an angle, because now from here, I'm trying to get an angle to view this from correctly, because if I try and move these vertices here, we can't exactly see how uneven everything is along that edge loop. So if I just click X and zoom around it, I can find an angle where I can get these loops blending in a little bit nicer. Then you can see down the bottom here, I need to fix this curve up as well and bring these down. And even though this edge loop is now, this piece has all become one, I will add in a little bit of detail, even though it won't be an actual border between these two. I will add in a bit of detail to make that line keep flowing through, but while keeping it all one element. So that's why I'm going to select these 2 points and scale them a little bit closer to each other. I can do the same for these points. Slowly cleaning it all. You can see from this point here, it's just not flowing really nicely. So that's why I'm going to move all these vertices down. And I'm also just going to pull this point in a little bit closer, because what's happening is we're going large, smaller, kind of same size, but actually it's a little bit bigger. So we want it to go from large, small, smallest. So I can grab all of these vertices and scale them all at once. You just want to gradually taper those points off. And this is where I'm just eyeballing these things. I'm just going to zoom in on this point and pull this in. I'm just going to delete these bits of geometry just to simplify things again. And this is, like I was saying, having the mesh this low res at this point makes things so much easier to clean up and to refine. So now the spacing of all these three parts is a lot more even. We don't go from one large piece to three tiny little ones, which is important in keeping the continuity of the mesh all around. Because when we had those, or when I had those three little pieces on the inside here, there was no other part on the mesh that kind of resembled that. So just moving on from that area, I've made a few big changes now. Now, one of the things I do like to do when making such a big change to that is just leave it for a little bit, let it kind of process in my mind what I've done to that bit, and just go in and just refine a couple of other areas on the mesh and just slowly get back to it, rather than working on that one area for say half an hour and trying to get it perfect. Because I've made that massive change just recently, in my head I haven't fully processed how I want that to look. So it's sometimes good just to leave things a little bit, come back to them a bit later, and you might have a better idea in your head of what you want to do with that mesh, or with that part of the mesh. So I'm going to move on to this piece down here and start cutting in a couple more details to refine how I want this area to look. So it's going to involve a little bit of tricky topology in this area, but I'll try and explain as I'm going kind of my thought process in how I want to add detail like this. Now, one of the things what I'm going to do while working on this is cut in some detail up here, and I'm going to terminate it on this curve. Now, one of the best things about this curve is that the edge loops flowing up into this part aren't hitting on an area that has a lot of curvature running this way. So that means we can get away with adding in more edge loops coming up here, and you can see even when I cut that, because the edge loop running along here is relatively flat, it doesn't add in any kind of pinching to that area. It adds a little bit, but once you add the smaller details and the beveling, that effect goes away and you get away with it. Whereas if this edge loop here was extremely rounded and we tried to cut these edge loops in, it'd be a lot more difficult to do that. You can see just by snapping that point there, created a nice edge loop. Now I just want to bring in another loop along here. I'm just going to leave that for now. So now I'm just pulling this geometry down to enhance the effect of this bevel I've just created, because I want to give it the appearance that there's two kind of ridges of detail going on here, and you can see right now it doesn't exactly look like that. So I'm just going to make a couple of adjustments to the mesh to make that start to happen, and one of those will be creating the topology to flow around here better. So from this point I'm going to cut in, and I'm going to cut in on this inside piece as well. just play with pulling this in. Now you can see if I had another edge loop along here on the very inside, it's reacting a little bit nicer. So now when I pull all these points in, that effect is coming off quite nicely. And I'm not sure yet, but I might want to add another bevel in just on this final inside bit. But I'm not completely sure yet. So by pulling these points in here, I'm giving myself the opportunity to add another bevel along here and keep that bevel flowing. And you can see we're starting to get a little bit of pinching here, and I will try and round that off, but before I do, I'm just going to make sure that I've got this inside shape cutting in. So I'm going to pull this out because I'm trying to create this bevel here and make that even. So I'm going to need to go from above, and this is where I'm just making a couple of modifications as I go, just pulling this in, sticking out a little bit too much. From underneath here, I can probably pull these in. Now from here, I'm just going to add one more loop on the inside, and I'm going to do this to enhance that effect. So I'm going to pull this loop in, and now you can see what that does is it just gives that loop I've created a little bit more of an effect. I'm just going to pull all this down and rotate it. Because as usual, you can see the loop flowing out here, and then all of a sudden it all starts going really bumpy and stuff, and that's that kind of goes against everything I've been trying to show you guys, where it's all perfectly neat and tidy. So that's where I'll just get edge constraint and just kind of slide those things down. Now I'm just starting to pull this loop in, even though we don't have any geometry up here. So that might be a little bit tricky to fix, but it's always important just to make sure you've got the right shape you want, and then worry about cleaning these types of straight areas up a little bit later. I'm not exactly sure yet, but I'm thinking I might connect those vertices like so. Now when I pull these up here, and connect this one, I can get away with removing this vertice. Now all I need to do is just go from the side here and pull it in until we've got it even with the rest of the edge loops flowing along here, because before it was sticking out too much. Just experimenting, just moving some things around. Just tidying things up. Don't really need to explain myself here. You can see I'm just slowly moving the vertices into place one by one. You can see just whenever things stick out a little bit weird, I'm just going in, evening them out. Just going to see if connecting a vertice like this and then removing this one helps, because now what I can do is I can pull that vertice down like so and we keep it all quads. Just grabbing that inside edge and pulling it in, scaling it out a little bit. So one thing I don't like on this mesh is this part here. It just looks different from everything else so far. So I'm just going to remove that. For now at least. Because I'm still not sure how I want this piece to connect to the main nose here. I might make this join up, or I might even unconnect this piece here. Or it's just, there could be just a way to get this, you can see right here, there's a kind of nice shape happening and it doesn't really go anywhere up the top here. So it could be good to connect those two and then maybe change it a little bit down the road in terms of how that piece is connecting. So just to explain what I mean there, I can connect these two bits and then go here and kind of connect something like that. And now when I delete those leftover faces, you can see we've got a new shape. Now I'm not fully happy with that, so that will change, but it was just to give you a bit of an idea of what I was kind of getting at there. So now I'm just going to pull this edge out here and connect it just to round this bottom shape off a little bit more. And then I'm going to grab all these loops and unselect the inside ones, obviously. And now I'm just going to extrude this backwards, setting the extrusion width to 0 because I don't want it to pull in like that and risk losing all the detail there. Now it gives me the option, if I want to add another edge loop along here like I had, and hopefully it looks a little bit more neat and tidy this time. I'm going to pull those up like so. Make sure that the spacing between all these edges is the same, and then just go in here and pull this in. Pull this out. And then pull this down and try and create a little bit more of an interesting shape going on there. You can see I'm just rotating things, just trying to figure out how to connect all these bits up. Just still playing with these shapes and getting the spacing right. You can see down here, this piece is a little bit small. The inside piece is bigger, and then this last piece is a little bit bigger than the first one, which doesn't really go with, doesn't really help to make things even. So that's why I'm just pulling this bit up. I'm going to try and get a couple more of these bits going into a sharper point. Now you can see I'm just quickly coming back here to work on getting this piece flowing. Just evening these edge loops out as well. So I'm a little bit worried about how this is pinching, but I'm just not going to waste my time changing that and trying to get that smoothing perfectly, because what I'm probably going to do is, over the course of this lesson, is make some big changes to how that curve's flowing. And if I don't, it's something that you can fix at the end anyway, so it's not really affecting things too badly at the moment, but you can see it's not smoothing perfectly, and that is something that I need to work out and solve.